predicate for a syntactic part of the predicate. But what I want to say is that really there's two ways you can get from you perceive blue rectangularly to you perceive rectangularly, and one of them is invalid, but another might be valid. So here's what you cannot do. I agree you cannot do this. You cannot say you perceive blue rectangularly, therefore you perceive bluely, and you perceive rectangularly, therefore you perceive rectangularly. That's invalid, because you can't go from 1 to 2. But that's just like saying X is a strawberry, therefore X is a straw and X is a berry, therefore X is a berry. That's the same kind of fallacy. And yet, this is perfectly valid, right? X is a strawberry, therefore X is a berry is a fine inference. So how does it work? Well, it just, the form of inference is of a different kind. It's something like X is a strawberry, being a berry is a determinable of which being a strawberry is a determinate, therefore X is a berry. What I suggest we do is to say the same thing about perception. You perceive blue rectangularly. Perceiving rectangularly is a determinable of which perceiving blue rectangularly is a determinate. Therefore, you perceive rectangularly. So I should say you can get from 1 to 3. It's just you can get there in one way, but not in another way. Maybe I'm missing something about Frank Jackson. Tell me what it is. OK, next objection. We quantify over intentionalia. That's a clever word for intentional objects or mere intentional objects. So we say things like, the dragon I dreamt of last night was yellow. The table I am hallucinating right now is brown. The apple I'm visualizing right now is prettier than the peach I visualized yesterday. All these are things that we say. We quantify over these merely intentional objects, hallucinata and visualizata, if that's a word. I don't think it is, but yeah, so how can we get around saying such a thing and still say everything that's true? Because these things are true. Well, I suggest we go fictionalist. In fictionalism, we say, well, all this is short. When you say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, that's short for, in the stories, in Conan Doyle stories, Sherlock Holmes is a detective. And the fictionalist operator in the Conan Doyle stories, it goes without saying, literally goes without saying, right? Which is why we say the things that we do in everyday life. So we could also say, likewise, according to the story of my dream, the dragon was yellow. According to the story of my hallucination, the table is brown. There are prettiness degrees D and D star such that according to the story of my current visualization, the apple is pretty to degree D. And according to the story of my visualization yesterday, the peach is pretty to degree D star, and D is greater than D star. That's the paraphrase. Now you understand why we don't talk like this in everyday life. why we resort to those easier, try to pick someone up with that sentence. So that's my response to the third objection. Fourth objection says that it's maybe better to think of intentionality as a relation to a content than a completely adverbial thing. The idea is that when you have a hallucination of a tree, it's not that there is an adverbial phenomenal character or something that makes it the case that a tree is what you're hallucinating. Rather, there is an entity called a content, and that you're related to that entity. You bear a relation to that content. I'm actually fine with this view, but I think we should not get confused on what the view is. Because the way people discuss intentional content nowadays, it's basically like they talk about intentional objects. We have to keep in mind that the only way this could be a response to the problems that we saw about hallucination, etc., is that if content is not what we think about. So people do say, when they discuss, let's say, within the literature or naturalizing intentionality, people say, well, there's a vehicle and there's a content. The vehicle is what does the representing, the content is what is being represented. That notion of content we cannot use here, because what is being represented, that's where that lands you in the can of worms. it needs to be a view of content as this thing that is not what is being represented. Maybe it mediates the representation, but it's not what is being represented. It's not what we think about. So if it's not what we think about, then to bear a relation to a content, it might be fine that the view says that we bear a relation in an intentional act, we bear a relation to a content. But that relation is not the aboutness relation, because you're not thinking about the content. The content is not what is being thought about. In this, the relevant notion of content that we can resort to here. So what it turns out, I think, is that this is basically a third version of adverbialism. It's a version of adverbialism which says that X represents dragon-wise if and only if X is a dragon-esque content. Because what it says is that it's not like in representing a dragon, you are related to a dragon. No, you are related to something else, the thing that is not what you think about. You're related to a content. So you represent dragon-wise, but what makes you represent dragon-wise is that you're related to this other entity, the content. We can bring that out by considering this thought experiment about the avant-garde literary movement, which they're kind of they're into the whole post-imperialist colonialism type thing, and they say they are very upset with the tyranny of concrete particulars. Everybody is writing novels about concrete particulars. Sherlock Holmes, Cinderella, they're all concrete particulars. Why aren't we writing novels about abstracta, about abstract particulars, tropes, events? Why should we always write novels? Well, maybe events we do write about, but why shouldn't we write about abstracta? And so let's think of what kind of entity a content is. Most people will tell you, what is the content of a thought about Sherlock Holmes? It's probably an abstract entity which consists of a cluster of universals, all the properties associated with Sherlock Holmes in the story. That's the content of a Sherlock Holmes thought. It's an abstract entity, a cluster of universals. Now these people, this guy, Schmonen Doyle, I guess we can call him, writes a story about this cluster of universals. He writes a story that there's a cluster of universals and it's related to other universals in all kinds of ways, and that's the story. It's a very nice story, it's very suspenseful, you're very pleased with it, but it's not about Sherlock Holmes. It's about some other kind. The whole idea was that we don't want to write about concrete particulars, we'll write about these other things. So that's clear that these contents are not what we're thinking about. So there is still a question. I said why I prefer phenomenological adverbialism over inferentialist adverbialism. And I guess here we have, what I'm claiming is that the idea that intentionality is a relation to a content is not a competition to adverbialism, because it is a version of adverbialism. But it will be a competition to phenomenological adverbialism. Why do I prefer phenomenological adverbialism? It's a big story, but basically there's a kind of Euthyphro dilemma that we can think of. Suppose I agree for the purposes of, for present purposes, that an experience of a tree both has a tree-ish phenomenal character and is related to a content, which is maybe the property of being a tree. Now the question is it related to the content in virtue of having its phenomenal character, or does it have its phenomenal character in virtue of being related to the content? And that's, of course, it's a huge issue, but it just happens to be that my view is that you're related to the content, the experience is related to the content because it has its phenomenal character and not the other way around. So you have the experience here and it has its phenomenal character here, and then there are these entities all the way out there, abstracta, certain